So I'm Gillian Music. I'm the general partner, managing director at Mastersfund. We are based here in Seattle, Washington. We are chartered to invest internationally. We invest in technology companies with women at the helm. We essentially play Moneyball for venture capital. We are following the money. We are following data that indicates which kinds of companies and what kind of composition will return a higher ROI. So we're happy to chew your ear off about that. But at the moment, I'd like to introduce Vani Rao. Vani comes to us as a venture partner, now principal partner at Mastersfund.
Thank you. I am Vani Rao, principal partner to Mastersfund, and I found my way into technology and innovation investing in a completely backwards manner. I did not come from the world of venture capital. I came from the world of derivatives markets and worked on the trade floor for almost 15 years before I transitioned and said, okay, I want to learn about this technology business, what's happening here. And I came into it from a financial lens, saw the opportunity, but for me, saw the intersection with the work that Gillian and the other managing director, Ann Kennedy, what they were doing, and I thought, oh my gosh, here's the opportunity to exploit and go become a fund manager and join this fund in what we're doing with Mastersfund. But on that topic, we had the opportunity to go to the World Economic Forum in Davos, and I personally had the opportunity to go twice. And the first time I went was the previous year in 2022. And at that time, Metaverse was all over the place. I kept hearing it, and I would say I ignored 90% of what was coming at me because I thought, well, what are they talking about? I said, I don't know what they're talking about. I don't know how this has value. How does this make money? You're just taking a bet on a digital thing. And I ignored it. Mm-hmm. Then we went back in 2023, and again, this time we could not ignore it. You had everyone from startups and people working in the industry, gamers, building panels to present how they were integrating it into our lives. But you also had executives, people at places like Lockheed Martin and Deloitte, identifying that this is here. We all know it's here, and they're talking about it. There was no way to ignore it. And somewhere along the way, it kind of clicked for me that this is a paradigm shift versus is there a metaverse or is there not a metaverse? Is the metaverse going away, for instance? I saw a headline with the closure of some of the projects they were working on in Disney and Microsoft. So some of their gaming projects were not successful, but that doesn't mean that we're not continuing this trend of taking the technology that we use and using it more and more immersively in our life. So Gillian, I thought you might have or be able to shed some light into the group. When you hear that word metaverse, what does it mean to you?
Right. So I think the first thing is I heard at least one person say, I'm a metaverse Luddite. I thought so too. We are not Luddites. We've been engaging with this metaverse for a very long time. Those of you whose parents, for example, would have played Super Mario Brothers had already created a personality, an engagement with what is becoming more and more deeply engaged, but still lives in 2 dimensions on a screen. Right? Now, they didn't engage with headsets, but they had already engaged with a universe created for a mechanical machine. That is what a metaverse is, right? The universe in which we live has 3 dimensions and tactile feel and scent, right? This one has sound, vision, and truly nothing else, but it can feel very immersive when you put a headset on. And we'll talk more about that sensation that you actually are feeling whatever is going on when you engage with a metaverse in such an immersive way.
I think that's a good point because what you've brought up is a lot of the buzzwords that people hear associated with metaverse. So maybe we should break down how these components play in. And I think we would start with actual VR and then go into AR and then ultimately into AI and how does AI fit into the metaverse? Because as Gillian points out with the example of gaming, we already immerse ourselves in technology. Look at our use and reliance of maps on our phone. We follow our device physically to get to the locations that we're going with. We are already immersed in technology. Now what is coming with the metaverse and the way that people are developing into it is how we're going to experience the benefits and potentially the drawbacks of technology in our immersive experience. We do. It tells us to turn onto a road that doesn't exist. That's a drawback, for example. That's us functioning in 3D or in multi-dimensions, actually, with the device telling us what to do. It's just going to continue. And so maybe you can break down, Gillian, some of those words around what does AR mean, what does VR mean, and then we can move into AI and what does that have to do with the metaverse.
Right. So AR is augmented reality, VR is virtual reality, and the differences between the two are fairly simple. A virtual reality is something that you experience in and of itself. You enter a universe created by artists and coders. AR takes the world around us and adds data to it. It literally augments our capacity as humans to engage with the world around us. So AR, for example, would allow me to pick up my phone and scan across here, and assuming there was, I don't know, Van Gogh painting there, it would tell me all about it. It would tell me what it was and about the painter and so on, the artist, etc. So it can be used in places like museums. It can be used in cities, right? Julia Beerbout runs, what is it called, Novabuy. And she creates these augmented reality experiences for cities so that travelers into those cities, people who are tourists, right, can kind of use their phones to learn about the buildings, the neighborhoods, the farmer's market, any kind of activity as well as a space. And in that, you can also use it for brands that would say, I don't know, a brand could take you through a space and show you, for example, people that don't really exist in a plaza or a space wearing, for example, I don't know, this manufacturer or that designer's clothing, right? It can do all kinds of things for you. It can promote brands, it can explain cities, it can provide historical context, and it can guide people who already have some kind of a disability as well. So as we engage with sound, if we are sight limited or blind, right, that can guide you through a city. And again, you have augmented the human itself, right? Virtual reality doesn't include the real world, if you will, the three-dimensional world in which we operate. It is its own environment that has been created by somebody else. So those are the two differences.
And then what does AI have to do with Metaverse? Does it have anything to do with Metaverse?
AI has something to do with everything, right? So the question is it intelligence or is it artificial intelligence? Right? Let's talk about what we're doing at Mastersfund, right? At Mastersfund, we're playing this money ball, right, for venture capital. We're taking in a great deal of data from a large number of companies. We have a cohort of 100 companies that we are building right now, which will have warrant investments. In other words, a venture debt thing. They're going to pay us back. But in order to pay us back, we come in when they make this much money, and when they make that much money per month, the MRR goes up, then they will begin to redeem this warrant. How do we know when they're going to redeem it? Well, we predict that in the beginning, and we use our intelligence to say, well, this is a good business model, this one isn't going to fit, this guy is going to make it by that time, and this one will make it sooner, all of that. But then you take in that data and you say, what did they earn this month and the next month and the next month? And what did it cost them to do it? And what were the CapEx costs? And what were the COGS? And on and on and on. You take in all of this data across just 100 companies. And now you can program something that says, all right, that is what happened, and these were the industries they were in, we've divvied it up, that's the intelligence, we've put that information in there. What's going to happen with the next one? This company comes to us and it's in the business of, I don't know, selling wine. All right, so it's a vintner, or it's a wholesaler, or it's the retailer, and it does this for a living. And by the way, none of that would happen because we're in technology, but that's okay, right? So we've chosen it, right? We identify what it does, and now it predicts for us. That's the artificial intelligence. Right? Instead of humans sitting there crunching through this data and thinking, what does it mean? What is the likelihood of success of this kind of company versus that kind of company? We have augmented ourselves. The intelligence that we have can be increased in terms of speed, volume of data, and if you will, the accuracy of the data. If we sit around and we talk about it, we think about things and we go, well, that company did this and that one did that and so on and so forth. We're just talking about it. And it's not scalable. even if there are 15 of us in the room.
I really like what you say, software AI guy here. I like what you say about how we've augmented our own intelligence. Would you say there's a preference in baking human bias into the model itself so that its predictions are in tune with what a person may have predicted?
Massively difficult.
Bias at the end, picking out those outputs and interpreting those.
Both ends, right? I often say, as I do a great deal of work in impact investing, right? And I often say that if the technologies of the future are not coded by, fingers to the keyboard, right, and directed by, and managed and owned by, and invested by all people, it will never serve all people, right? We know that 98% of capital goes to guys. But do you know that more than 2/3 of that 98%, and we're talking about capital that's in venture capital, right? This is venture capital money to build new companies. 98% is awarded to men, 2% to women. And that's all women of any background, of any color. But more than 2/3 of the 98% is given to tall, white, American-spoken, youthful, slender, able-bodied males from Harvard or Stanford, just 2 universities in the entire planet, with a baritone voice. And you guys were so darn close. So close.
Check.
But don't worry, you still have 33% left, right? Us gals did not get on the stage. Wani never got close to that stage. Because when we say 2% of venture capital goes to women, we mean white women. The amount of capital going to women of color, not just in the States, but worldwide, is less than 0.5%. All right. Now, clearly, there is an imbalance. But the guys didn't do a bad job. They did a great job, right? The question is, why are the tall white guys, replicating themselves? And that's a whole nother conversation around it, right? And it is not their fault. This is, well, I'll give you the short background, right? If a humanoid infant had cozied up to a saber-toothed tiger some 30,000 years ago, it did not last long. It had to instinctively cozy up to its own kind for survival. But it is not only humans. It's all mammals that do this, and all the birds that fly in flocks, and all the fish that swim in schools, and even the plants on our planet Earth will grow in clusters. This is a survival mechanism of a carbon-based life form. You're not going to change it. But we can deal with it in 2023 when it no longer suits the planet. And you brought up a very good point. Okay? The point being that it must be engaged in by all people at every level of the game. And so we lean in by saying we're changing the flow of capital. To whom this capital goes will make different kinds of companies.
Thank you. Oh, you continue. Go ahead.
Just one final point. In the training of these models and historical data that comes from time eras that are very skewed towards particularly gender, race, typical backgrounds, finding data for these models that is then going to try and be agnostic towards these traits. I mean, how do you, strike that balance? How do you find data that is not going to, like you said, cluster together to its own kind?
Right. So in our case, it is going to be, if you will, segmented data, right? We invest in women-led technology companies. This will be the data from our background, right? So we're creating that to inform our own model. We will not be able to tell you what happens if you invest in sub-Saharan Africa in companies run by all-male teams in the agricultural sector. Ain't gonna happen. But we must trust that our colleagues will work on other equities and other solutions, right? We cannot boil the whole ocean. But it is just an example of how you use artificial intelligence and how you build it that augments the human intelligence. It's simply, if you will, machine learning with a capacity to predict what happens next. Machine learning is the gathering of all that data, the crunching of that data, and says, oh, that's what happened. And here are your images, your charts and graphs and so on. This is what happened. Artificial intelligence says this is what will happen. And it is far more precise than a human memory.
I think it's important that we bring up the point here of making sure that there are more diverse populations building into the group. More competition, right? You do have biased data sets. We're going to have them across companies. But if there is a diverse group of companies competing with each other, here's the challenge when you think about a platform like Facebook or other social media, Instagram, even YouTube. They're built by people who were very similar to one another in these categories, and they were funded by people very similar to that. And so their competition was just people who looked like them, but lesser of them. That fed the model, and we saw their great benefits. I shared with someone in this room just earlier that I get a lot personally out of using some of these platforms, but I've also seen the destruction of our well-being, of our civilization at risk when you think of what happens when groups come together on these social media platforms and we have an insurrection, like in January 6th. So how can we think about doing it better and doing it smarter? I think it's about getting more competition out there to say, because there's two parts to it. Not only are the models different and potentially smarter or better, but competition is competition. There's marketing that goes into play, language, education, all of these things for it to really be adopted. So part of the issue with VR today, especially for me, I can't put on an Oculus. I don't feel comfortable in it. I'm just not into it. And that wasn't built for me, quite frankly. Someone said, you know what? It's going to be so fun to play a game like this, dude. I'm just going to go do it. And that's what they did. And it served one group. However, I am very open to the idea of virtual reality coming to me in another form if it's developed by other people. And we have the good fortune of being able to see a lot of different entrepreneurs who are approaching it from different angles. And if you think beyond some of that discomfort that might be associated with the early versions, even the earliest were probably the most uncomfortable, and they're getting better, you have groups developing things to enable populations that are not included today, populations that might be on the autism spectrum, for instance, sensitive to different types of dimensions, more so than other people. Now, if those types of technologists are actually developing these tools as well, it is going to be more comfortable for a broader audience as a result. So competition is healthy here. I believe that capitalism can actually do well in this market if it flows more broadly. We do a big emphasis here on emphasizing that to our portfolio companies, because they are going from Web 2 to Web 3 to be able to live in this sort of manner. So let's talk about that.
Hang on. Karen had a question, and we have one more in the back.
Okay.
I was just actually going to make a comment based on what was said on the data analysis. The current waves of AI look at historic patterns, which creates the problems we're all talking about. But there is a new wave of AI that doesn't look at historic data. The new wave of AI is looking at data on what futuristic, so an example would be weather. It's not looking at the historical patterns of weather, but it's looking at what will be the change in weather because of climate change. And then that aligns with what is the impact. How does that change the dynamic of economies? How does that change the dynamic of geographies? How does that change the area? Pick any one of these areas, so it's no longer saying just because the pattern was historically this, the past does not predict the future always. Right. And that new wave of AI is where a massive dynamic is going.
Well, let's talk about that too, because we're talking about people who are focused on markets. I know I came from an era where people were really focused on quant trading and these ideas of technical trading, where there was this belief that markets would actually move because of a certain thing, things like inflection points. I mean, there are models built around it. I went through that, and my opinion of that was they only exist because people think that they exist. So to your point, there are models trying to always predict what's going to happen, and there's a limitation to it. But you're talking about generative AI. That is the future of it's not just taking the past information, it's taking the inputs that you're giving live at that moment, and it knows what to do with them the way a person might do it. It is taking some of the task work out of what a person is doing, or enhancing their ability to do that task in a
Yes.
more informed and smarter way. And it's not just relying on the past, but the data has to come from somewhere, and the data comes from the using of that. And so you have to think about the user base that comes in, and your data sets that are being filtered, the types of inputs. So yes, it may not rely on all the historical data looking back, but anybody building the models too has to continue to train it, and that's how it gets smarter.
Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question about competition. So we're talking about the metaverse. It is a type of virtual reality. Is there, or are there, or in your work, is there a competition with the metaverse, or is the metaverse just owned by Facebook alone? You know, like what's
Oh, no, there's a huge
There are many
competition.
competitors who are building inside this thing. It's like saying, is there competition for the financial market? It is a thing, and inside, many folks are active. So it is not a concept that's owned, even though Facebook changed its name to Meta. Nobody owns it.
And to give you an extreme example of that, so for potential investment opportunities, one that we came across really focused on taking the globe and mapping it and breaking it out, the real estate, into pieces. And they're selling those pieces right now. There are multiple companies doing this.
Yes.
And it is possible that this could be the next blockchain or the next digital currency, or, you know, there's a FOMO developed around this, where somebody is mapping the world, and people are going to want to use these spaces to enhance their products, to enhance their marketing, to enhance their experiences, and whoever owns that asset might be able to do something like lease it out. These concepts are
So,
what's
hang on.
developing in the metaverse.
Who here is representing K&L Gates? And what would K&L Gates pay to be certain that they owned in this metaverse the K&L Gates building in which you actually operate, not just here in Seattle, but New York and Los Angeles and London and so on and so forth, right? Now, anybody here, what would you pay to own the piece of property that sits next to, I don't know, Bloomingdale's, the World Trade Center? How about the Empire State Building? How about St. Paul's? The caterer has something to say.
Sorry, I also work in the finance world, it's terrible. But in 2004, Pizza Hut purchased the first Metaverse identified item. It was in the World of Warcraft. They purchased a Pizza Hut market stall, which allowed gamers to order pizza, direct delivery drivers to pass pizza through windows around the back end of your house, so you never had to stop gaming. It sold for $1.2 billion.
We have been engaged with this metaverse for quite some time, and brands have already been making money there. I'm just saying, it's not new, right? But this concept of the FOMO, that's what we were talking about. Somebody's mapping the world. What would you pay to be the one that buys that? Do you remember when we had, how about when we had domain names, right? Didn't you want cash.com? Didn't you want cars.com? I mean, we all missed it, right?
Maybe I'm jumping at it, let me know if I am, but is the idea of the increasing value of AR and VR based on the premise that the world is going to move towards a more willingness to use VR? Because I can't think
Yes,
of
it
any
is.
colleagues who really enjoy
Absolutely.
video calls on Teams, and to think that everyone's going to move to a place where they freely spend their time in this place and
Yeah.
hold that much value in it.
Yes
Is that a
and
big
no.
premise? Love to hear your
So
thoughts.
yes, it is based on that, and no, you are not the target market. Our children are being trained to engage in the metaverse on a regular basis, to conduct their social lives there, and to be a deep part of it, and they will grow up not being the Luddites, just as, well, I don't know, how many of you came of age in a world that did not have Google? Right. It's about 40% of the room. Not so long ago, it was 100% of the room. Okay, that's what's happening now. our children are doing that. So why don't you talk about how you manage that? You've
Oh,
got two
absolutely.
daughters.
Well, and it occurred to me in a different fashion where we were talking about photographs, and there is a generational shift where younger generations know how to be photographed no matter what they're doing. They can be talking, they can be speaking. I am not of this generation. I had to wait until my pictures were developed when I first started taking pictures, and so I can take very good head-on shots, but when I'm in motion or doing something, I don't know what to do. Yet, if I go on Instagram, I can find young people to train me to do that. And you actually look at people in the demographic of, let's say, 15 to 25 right now, they're very good picture takers because they've always had the ability to take their picture, and they're taking pictures all the time of their friends, and they look good and they know what to do with that. That's a trained and learned behavior. That consumer learned how to do it and interact with it, and they're going to continue to behave that way onwards into the future. When I look at my children, who are 4 and 7, they play Roblox right now, and they are building worlds. They are being trained to build this world and live in these realities. And my controller, my question is, who do I control that comes in? And do I let anybody in? Because the answer is no, I don't for my own children. And I had a lot of sensitivity about whether or not I would let them play for that reason, because I didn't want it, because I can't control that. I know that it's an immersive experience for them, and I want them to have some of that skill set that's coming. They are being trained to exist in the reality, and we will adopt it. We will be the slower adopt it, and there will be better versions of it. But children today are already building cities. If you played Sims, for example, at some point in your life, this is a much more enhanced version, and it moves on in that way. And parents, and then going back to the competition, have a responsibility to understand. So when we were actually in Davos, the World Economic Forum, we did speak with panels of successful gaming companies and organizations who were marketing these types of products to children. And the question came up, how do you keep people out? The bad people out, the people you don't want into those rooms. And first, the audience, I mean, we were met with silence from the panelists, and they include executives, and they included, again, some technology builders. And they focused on a few aspects. One was, let's wait for the regulators to do something.
I wasn't having any of that.
Right, I came from derivatives markets, and I saw what happened before regulation kicked in 2008 and Dodd-Frank, and what existed afterwards. Sure, we can wait for regulators and try to self-regulate. We'll see how that turns out. That's one option. That was how they met it. And the other thing that they did indicate is that parents have a responsibility to be educated. Now, that's scary. Now, I am sitting here listening to Metaverse and trying to understand what this means and gather, okay, what do I do for my child? But I'm sitting here in it. I don't know, that's not an acceptable answer to me, in the sense of, I don't expect most people to have an awareness of the dangers that are posed. And that's where I go back to competition again, because it can be brought out where you get your kids over to this platform or to this platform and let it play out that way, so that the competition can identify what might be the safer ones before everything goes wrong, and then the regulators have to step in. But it goes to a good point, because there was a letter that came out today that addressed these things with respect to AI. And they want to halt the computational power of how it's being developed until these individuals and these companies and people within the industry work with regulators to put some controls in place. There's a pause, for example. I don't know how much there will be a pause, but I think it's worth going into some of these questions that they presented, because they're interesting, and talk about whether or not there's actually an impact from this letter, to be determined. I want to see the demographic of all the people who have signed this letter and understand who is going into it. But I thought the questions were interesting, and they're worth addressing, but I don't think that they necessarily call for a halt in technology and innovation. These are things that are making our lives better, and personally, people can't resist it.
even if there were an open call.
So hang on a second. In terms of what we were talking about, for example, at Davos, there was a company that enabled corporations to provide immersive experiences to train people. Think about a physician who must learn to do surgery. This is brilliant. They would get to do it again and again and again until they were very good at it without having to do it on humans or even animals. Pretty good. There were simple things. You could teach people how to work together within a restaurant environment so things moved smoothly and efficiently. And they could learn that quite effectively rather than just being spoken to or even have pictures or cartoons or something and so on. Brilliant, especially if you have a workforce that doesn't necessarily have the local language as a native language, and an awful lot of us are moving around the world. Sounded pretty good. Same thing with learning to make beds in a hotel or something simple like that. So, number of ways you can use it for both complex and simple corporate things. At the same time, we spoke about how to use that at Davos itself. They're going to create immersive experiences, and rather than be a once-a-year event, they will now invite people from all over the world and people with more physical abilities and disabilities to show up during the year and start talking together to solve some of the world's most complex problems. Brilliant idea. Okay, all good. Then we get to the social. And that's when we talked about things like, how do you keep them safe? And I'll fess up, it was me. I was sitting in the front. It was about 6:30 at night. I was hungry, I was tired, and I'd had enough. And I said, how will you keep the children safe? Sitting behind me was Vani. She has a child, 4 and 7. And behind that, or next to her, behind me again, was somebody whose children were 10 and 12. And then somebody whose children were just entering college. All of them, 2 and 2. And I thought, all of these young ladies are going to be inside the metaverse. And they're going on about, well, if the child takes the parent's key and then, there's nothing, that's not what I asked. I don't worry about the children in that space. They're doing just fine. And Mommy's not going to let them take her key. They're where they should be in their cloistered garden. How will you keep it safe from those who would come in, not the children? That was what got dead silence. And I said, all right, allow me to be plain. We can't keep our children safe on Facebook. They are lured out of your living rooms and down the hall, and god-awful things happen to these young children, both boys and girls. All right? Now, this little child is going to sit inside a metaverse. In other words, they're in their living rooms and in their bedrooms, and they're so immersed into it. This is what we talked about for a moment. They feel it. They're children. They barely have minds that are forming. None of them are formed. Okay? We feel it when we get inside. We feel warm or cold, depending on what we are experiencing inside these virtual realities. Imagine what this feels like to a child. And that child will be raped in somebody's metaverse and will have never left their home. What are you going to do to protect against that? Because that is a very dark side to it. All right? And that's what we have to look at, both ends. There's a question in the back, and then this gentleman.
I absolutely do not have an answer to the question you just asked. There's an interesting analogy emerging from the 3 different industries we just touched on, 2 of which we touched on, one of which I'm going to introduce. So we talked about sort of the metaverse and how Facebook is existing in this space, and what are the access points into that. And then, we're sort of experiencing a similar moment right now with AI. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of America thinks that ChatGPT is AI, right? They don't understand, nor do they ever really need to, what is going on with the algorithms that are the subject of these letters. But I wonder if there are lessons to be learned from an industry that has gone through this thing where 95% of their users, probably closer to 100, don't understand the infrastructure, which is cloud, right? The vast majority of Americans probably think that the cloud is Google Docs and Gmail. And I don't know that they need to know what goes into the cloud if they understand that Google Docs helps me do the things that I need to do. And so I'm curious if you think that there is an opportunity for those working on the infrastructure of the metaverse to stop trying to convince people that they have to understand the infrastructure and the operations and the things that don't affect the majority of the people that will eventually be in the metaverse. I think there are lessons to be learned from craft.
So how many people have ever fixed a vehicle's inability to start by playing with the butterfly valve? The oldest man in the room except for me. Okay? The rest of you don't even know what the heck it is, because you don't have to. It no longer functions, it no longer exists, right? But these were the things of a mechanical vehicle, right? They used to crank them up. There are laws, I believe it's in Wisconsin, where somebody has to walk 3 feet in front of any vehicle that is operating and wave a white flag to warn the others that it's coming, right? This still sits in books on some of these states, right? It's amusing. It was the beginning. And everybody was supposed to know everything about how it worked. But how many of us even change our oil anymore, or, I don't know, maintain these things in any way, right? And it is just a thing, a technology thing, and it evolves over time. The same thing with computers. I believe, well, the caterer is my daughter, by the way. Thank you. Okay, she learned to code with, wasn't it frogs or something? You had to make squares and whatnot, right? Turtles. She had to learn, turtles, right, turtles, sorry, not frogs. You were right, you had children too. Okay, so these children learned to code the very first bits and pieces, and we had green screens and white text and so on and so forth, right? Nobody does that anymore. Now we are dragging and dropping and pulling in different ways and so on. Things are built in different ways. Almost nobody knows how the whole thing comes together. So what I would suggest is that we don't have to convince these people that everybody on the planet has to know how this metaverse works or how this whole thing comes together. Truly, over time, nobody will. Nobody will care anymore. It's on to the next piece. Only those who get to build it get to learn it. And right now, your children are learning to build that metaverse. Their children will go, whatever, it already exists. The skyscrapers are there.
There's a fine balance. People need to be educated on how to use it. They don't need to know the intricacies, but the builders should be brought, more builders should be brought. So when you think about people actually developing into the metaverse, when you think about men and women, it's actually only 8% are women, and that's not enough. So there are not enough builders coming in, so people do need to know it so that they can try and access it and open into it. Now, there's a whole discussion on funding to go there that I'm not getting into. But that said, so there's that introduction, but people have to be trained to understand it. And it's actually my good friend Raj here who presented to my class that the importance, or good companies have to educate people on how to use it. So there's a customer education that has not taken place yet that will take place. And it's not going to be about the computational power or data or training data. None of that is going to go into here. And that's why when you read the letter, the questions are kind of open and bizarre in a sense. Right. And I think
we don't know who signed it, but we have a feeling they aren't deep into the system.
Well, we know, it's just people don't need to know the details. In reality, the only reason is if they're developing into it, but they are going to be engaging with it. Bots are here. We all already engage with bots. Bots are not getting just smarter, but they're learning to recognize our social cues that we're giving back to them. They can recognize our emotions. And who is developing that? Who's making that smarter and better? And so we should be, or we ought to be aware that that's happening in front of us, even if we don't know what that is. So there's an education that needs to happen into the market. That's not the responsibility of quite frankly, us or anyone. That's the responsibility of the companies coming in and educating the market on how to use the product. And I always go back to the competition. The more competition you have others teaching how to use the product. It's good for a company to have competition. Lots of people can educate the market on how to use this space. And then you don't need to care about the computing power or any of those numbers.
Right. So before we get on to the second question, how many of you have used Mastodon? Oh, my heavens. Okay, there we go. Okay, and, right, so, if Twitter isn't what you want, there's an option now, and, there are a number of folks jumping in there and looking for a different way for people to engage and to remove some of the negativity of some of the other platforms that exist. All I'm saying is, this continues to evolve, and so I hear your cry. Do you need the whole world to know? And the answer is no, they'll get over it. They'll get over it and the world will move on.
So I guess just going back a couple examples ago, it seems to me that some of the frankly horrifying societal risks associated with the metaverse can just be avoided by not allowing our kids or ourselves to put on a headset and immerse ourselves in that.
Or get in a vehicle or an airplane or a boat, or to engage with traffic lights at corners, or even to go to school. I mean, it exists. Don't try to stop the world. Learn to engage well. All of our world is dangerous. Life itself is terminal. None of us get out of it alive, right? Along the way, take as much as you can of it. Just, again, embrace as much as you can, but be mindful. Fire will keep you alive, and it will kill you. Water will keep you alive, and it will kill you, right? This metaverse is not likely to kill you, but there are downsides to everything.
And another
Don't be frightened, just engage wisely.
beautiful theme of here is that also spoken at the World Economic Forum, focused on art and business. And I first went to some of these events kind of skeptical about what they were going to present.
Yeah.
But there's also an art in all of this creation and the creative design, because there's a human element that goes in it, and there's the human bias, but some of it wants to create and thrill, and that's an emotion that we can't actually capture. One of the questions in here, and it reminds me of that, should we...
Hang on. Oh, you're good?
Yeah,
Okay.
should we automate all the jobs, including the fulfilling ones? The fulfillment comes from that creation. So yes, you could just not immerse yourself into an experience, or we could lock ourselves out of it. But we are going to be missing out on some creativity. We come into these buildings, and yes, they have a function, but I have heard now 4 stories about this particular room. This room had a design aspect created, and people remember it. There's an art to it. And even in what we're talking about today, that art is what makes that connection to it, and it's inevitable that we're going to engage with it because people want us to do it, and it's a product of creativity. It's a product of design.
Mm-hmm. So on that note, there seems to be more and more, pushback or initiatives, kind of the initiative to get people off their cell phones, to get back to real life, toxicity of social media for young kids. Do you think those are just kind of short-term hurdles that are going to get worked out and they won't gain any steam? Because it seems like you have to assume that it's inevitable. People are not going to be playing outside. They're going to be on, in VR. Mm-hmm. And do you think that, maybe this is an ESG question, but do you think that's good or bad, or just that's how society's going to go?
How should I say, rather than looking at good and bad, I would look at what is, and then say, what is the likelihood that the entire community of humans, all over the planet, not just some cloistered, well-heeled humans like we all are, we're all in this room, we are in the top, 5-10% of financially qualified humans on the planet, all right? Now, the rest of the world, it doesn't live in our thoughts and our fears and our, and so on and so forth. But even looking at our little group, what you're saying is, should we take the children off the cell phones? You absolutely should take children off cell phones, and 100% of the time, absolutely not, right? Each thing has its wisdom and balance, and as parents, I think it's our job to make sure that there is that balance delivered to our children, right? Parenthood is not a democracy. This is a benign dictatorship, and sometimes it's not so benign, right? Okay, sometimes you put your foot down, right? So do what you have to do, right? But at the same time, I wouldn't lock out all technology. Do I think that it's something that's just a blip in, the human adoption of these things? Any new toy is exciting, right? And some are more, more addictive, more delicious, more engaging. And so it's more difficult to put it down. Again, as adults, it's important for us to put it down. As parents of people who are not yet adults, it's important to make sure they put it down. So I wouldn't necessarily, just abdicate our role there, but I also think that these are things that will settle down. It's not that the world is going to go inside forever. This is not going to happen. And I don't even think that it happens as much as we think it happens today.
Well, and I think we've embraced, we as our society, we went through the pandemic and we went to video. We do much, much more communication via video. We all have our own video, what we subscribe to, and that we do take calls, even if we go to an office. Everybody is now doing video conference. And you know who sees that? Our children. They see that engagement, and it's inevitable. That is not at conflict with going outside and playing. I think both worlds exist, and I don't see it as a conflict. The idea that rather is you can get more information to other people, because to your point on access is that now the beauty of our phones and having information available is that we can be more educated and make more smarter decisions over and over. Why would we give that up? We're not. And you know what? We're in a competitive world. We're trying to give our children the tools to also compete and also be smarter. And part of that involves in engaging with devices or engaging with technology if you want, or engaging with the outside world if you want. It's part of giving them the tools to be able to grow into society. Right. And so they're not at odds with each other. They're just a manifestation of how you let your child be trained to go into adulthood with these things. And I guess at the end of the day, there's a bigger requirement to educate and get educated. But how do you do that? You do that through the devices themselves.
Right, I was going to say, there'll be an app for that tells you if you've gone out enough and put your phone down enough.
So you think maybe where was it, 20 years ago, you might have had your Sega Genesis and your parents limited you to 1 hour a day. You think maybe in the future it'll be 1 hour of AR with your friends, but then you might have schoolwork or other training and a lot of other aspects of life that are made more efficient through these sorts of technologies.
Yes, of course you can do that, and businesses can control access. Businesses can say what their employees can access. But during that time when we talk, what the topic that's come up is how safe are you once you're in that world? And in that environment, I can say my kid can only have an hour or whatever, but once they're in there, what is the risk or the danger of what's communicated to them? And in that case, my point of view is only AI can manage and monitor and control AI. And they can't do it 100%. So frankly, as an investor, I'm looking for the AI that monitors and identifies and alerts dangers of AI. And when I find that company, I'm going to put a lot of money into it.
So somebody was saying how new and different this was. Yes, there is a question in the back. But hang on one second. Somebody was talking about all of this, and I don't know, somebody who was maybe 25 or 30 said, yeah, but we all grew up with stranger danger. Right? We learned this in the real world when we were in kindergarten, right, to stay away from strangers and so on. And what they're saying is the location may have changed, right, but the essence still remains. And so things that are dangerous, we must teach it, we must protect the children, they have to get good at it. Things that they can engage with, they should embrace with both arms.
Hi, so I like the theme we're going on now with access. I wanted to find out if you have any information about, the metaverse and actual, when I'm talking about access, not like at work, but there's a divide in the US, the haves and the have-not. So we can talk about that. And then you're talking about into the metaverse, picking out, mapping the world, picking out whatever building in whatever country. So again, when we look at the US, Europe, whatever, and other maybe some developing countries, what is the accessibilities for the metaverse, in terms of, say, education, like you're talking about the doctor, or just learning in general?
Right. So Sugata Mitra is an Indian-born British educator who has done a great deal of work around education itself, about different populations, and how he noted that his friends, who were all very well heeled, had brilliant children. You wouldn't believe what my 8-year-old can do on this computer or on that mobile device, and yet all of the children who had no money, who were poor, somehow they were all stupid. And he thought, well, what would happen if we put a computer into the cloud? Would those kids do as well as those kids? Let's see what happens. And this concept of computer in the cloud, you can look it up online and so on, and again, the name Sugata Mitra. And it exists, and people have funded it, and it is teaching children. I would say that is a bit of a metaverse. It will get better, right, as we are able to deploy these technologies into places all over the world. In particular, there was a group in Tamil Nadu, and what he does is he sticks the thing into a wall and kind of gives it some kind of protection, but the children can engage with it, and they say, what is it? I have no idea. And, can we touch it? I guess, I don't know. And, well, what are you going to do with it? I have no idea, and I'm leaving. That was his process. Okay, and then he came back 3 months later to see what was going on, and they had taught each other to browse, they had learned different things, and then he, loaded up a computer with information around human genomes and, all kinds of medical information, whatever, and left that there in some village in the middle of nowhere where he was pretty sure there would be no technologist wandering by, and so on. And again, 3 months later, came back. And the results were interesting, and you should look this up. What the children said was, one little girl, hands on her hips, said, well, you've given us a computer that speaks English, and we spoke Tamil Nadu. We had to teach ourselves English. Very frustrating. Second thing was, he gave them some kind of a test around whatever it was there. And, in the beginning, of course, they knew nothing. And now they knew, 35, 40%. And he came back and they knew more and so on. He said, well, what have you learned? Absolutely nothing. Right, and how long did you play with it before you decided to give? Oh, no, we haven't given up. We see it every day. We come back. Really? And she said, yeah, except for the fact that the imperfect replication of DNA leads to systemic disease in humans, we really don't know a thing about how that disease develops. 15 years ahead of her time, okay, in a few months. Watch it. Look at it, learn more about how that works. Again, it's the beginning of the engagement of these kinds of technologies that can change the world, right? Who knows what this little girl will become, right? Or many others. Teaching people language, for example. It turns out we have an Esperanza on this planet, it's just English. Right? It is the language of business around the world. And your ability to speak it can get you a very good job in some places that are very difficult to get a job, let alone to live. All right? So if you speak it clearly enough and you can get a job so that they can bother you about your MasterCard bill on the telephone, then you've made it, right? Enabling that repetition of sound and learning and so on through this kind of technology enables more people to engage. Right? And here in the United States, we tend to speak one language. Maybe we could finally learn to communicate with the rest of the world as well.
On access, yes, there's the communication and I think social media has enabled it. We yes. Connect with so many more people than when we would have been able to prior to it. And that is a positive thing. I've learned from people connecting all over the world that I would meet all over the world and then meet again on social media, meet again in New York, meet again in Seattle. That's enabled by this tool for me. But I have access. Now you bring the metaverse in. The goal is, for some, to be able to bring communities together from around the world. Women, for instance, can gather in certain groups, and we almost executed on that, where we thought, okay, let me look at this metaverse. Where would we want to gather women around the world? Let's go buy a spot in Dubai. Let's go buy a spot in Bangalore. Let's go buy a spot in London, here in New York, and here in Seattle, and say, these are our spots. We're reserving them here in our metaverse. Yes, we're making this metaverse real estate play, first of all, but we want to develop. We're going to go bring a designer in and develop a place where people can come and learn about something that we want to share with them and have a discourse and a discussion. It does open up access if populations have access to the internet and to information. So there's two parts to that, getting that. But that said, a lot of what we're talking about, especially with the games in the metaverse, take advantage of those who are the least aware, the poorest. You think about single mothers, for instance. It was Gillian who shared a very troubling story about how these are set up, that it is easy for children to start spending money. And there are actually studies about when the parents realize and the demographic of those people. And over again, it was single mothers, typically BIPOC mothers, who waited the longest, who had to pay the biggest price of that exposure. That's not right. That's not the right type of access. And so being cognizant of it, you can consciously invest around it, and you should consciously invest around it. That is a strategy to make money, but that is a strategy to make money off of the socioeconomic and the exposures of populations. So there is a very fine line between embracing the benefit of the access points and many of the enhancements that you have, but also knowing that there will be systems and companies in place that are taking advantage of the systems that are in place because people are exposed. People are exposed by their awareness and their knowledge about the products that are being utilized, and quite frankly, the time that can be spent to be aware around that.
In 1920, there were children who were working on the railroads that opened this section of the country. All right? This is not new. To exploit children, to exploit demographics that don't have access to, the protections of society is not new. Right? I would also encourage you, because these conversations can be, if you will, a little depressing, right, as well as informative. But there is a great deal of hope and excitement engaged with this as well. And I would encourage you to look at the work of Hans Rosling, R-O-S-L-I-N-G. If you haven't done it before, this is a person who worked deeply with the Gates Foundation, among other things. He's now passed away. He worked in hundreds of years, centuries of work, looking at the progress of the world, the equities in the world, as well as its inequities. Over time, things have become so much better, and he only looked at centuries, not millennia, right? Things are absolutely awful, and they have never been better, and both these things are true. That's how he begins his series. I'd say it's worth taking a look. There's a lot of work to be done, but things are in very good hands. And coming out of Davos, I think we could both say that. This was a gathering of people with really brilliant minds, good hearts, and an awful lot of weight on their shoulders to change this world and make it a better place. And they were talking to each other, and there was a powerful amplification effect in that. So we came away not only exhausted, overwhelmed, completely, inebriated with the amount of knowledge we had come away with. This was just one tiny piece, right? But also encouraged and warm. One last question, and then we should.
I think, Raj, you had a question. I think we have two questions.
Two questions, okay.
Go ahead, Raj.
So do you see this is going to impact the belief system? And if it does, how do you see this?
Back in, 1984, I put a computer onto my desk because I had more self-control than, what Heath Sina thought. They were going to put it on my desk for 2 weeks, and then you could return it if you decided to, but whatever. Within 2 hours, it owned me, body, soul, and mind, this thing, the things it could do that I couldn't possibly do way back in 1984. Later on, I would say the crack in the universe was the arrival of the web, not DARPANET, not the bulletin board services and so on, but really the web, color, and then sound. All right? And that changed everything. My children played Sonic the Hedgehog with children in San Diego and Singapore and Stockholm. And I thought to myself, it's going to be a lot harder to put a gun in these young children's hands and say, go kill. They're going to say, are you crazy? I play games with them on Saturday night. The hope of that universe in which technology could connect people continues, and it becomes even more intense in this metaverse, right? That's the hope of it. I think that far outweighs the dangers that we do have to manage, because everything has two sides to the coin.
Well, let's talk about
we need like a technology card
But
It already is a god, the cloud, we look at it into
But
the
look at our
sky.
willingness already and all of our change, I would presume all of us, I'm making an assumption here, but many of us probably wouldn't have been comfortable putting a credit card online at some point in our
Right.
life. And then, now I don't think twice about it. For a while, I would still look for the lock.
Yes, but we have no trouble
but-
handing our credit card to somebody who goes to the back room to go, bill us
So-
for dinner and come
but
back.
the belief there is that we actually have grown to trust what's happening, that somebody is offering us a service via this internet, and it's going to be the service that we're paying for, and that's a good belief, right? Or we get into cars with strangers. I mean, that is
Yes,
absurd.
we do.
But those people drive us to our destination, and where you're safe because our phone is tracking us, I mean, maybe. But there is a change in belief there, and you know what that change in belief is? It's a reliability that people are actually good, and that they are doing the service that they are providing, and that they're using these tools to, again, enhance and do commerce and business in a positive way. So the belief is, I think, moving towards a more trusted world, and that's a utopia of sorts, but that's enabled here.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
It seems like there is an interesting observation about the relationship of how many times Mark Zuckerberg mentioned Metaverse and the price of Meta's stock. So the more he mentioned Metaverse, the more dropped of the price. That's an interesting observation. And the other thing is that last year, it seems like Microsoft dismissed one of its largest Metaverse team. They're still thinking about people feel heavy dizzy when they wearing a helmet and things like that. So that's why they decided to do something to reorganize the structure. That doesn't mean that we don't have positive view towards the future of Metaverse, right? It seems like I would say the CEO of Unity, and also if you look at the data, all these children in Europe, that's what my knowledge is, and my information is. It seems like every child in Europe, they have an account. What is the name of let me think about it. It's like a game. It's a game app, and by using the technology of Metaverse. So it's combined by all of this. Seems like we still have a long way to go if we're looking at the big picture of the development of Metaverse and how the future is really going to reshape everyone's daily life.
You hit on 2 points there. There is a meta to it in the terms of repeating the word metaverse, and Mark Zuckerberg saying that on Facebook, you can trade off that, right? There is actually data coming out of the words and the different types of language that are available to be digested and make a trade on. But then on your other point, I want to touch on something that we felt as we left, is that there's a lot of development happening globally. And there's always competition within the US too, but we were hearing far more from people in Europe, people in Asia, about what they were building, and they are advanced. There are cities being built in the Middle East, what you would truly call smart cities. Now, are they being built with culture and art in mind? Maybe, because you don't want to end up with a sterile smart city. For it to work, you have to have that level of engagement in it.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, those are happening. You don't hear about it happening here. So there is a lot of opportunity internationally, and I think that we may be forced to catch up, and it actually has to do a lot with the situation the innovation economy is in the moment.
Right, well, I think that,
Oh, Roblox, yes, Roblox, yes.
Roblox,
And,
yes.
well, my kids.
and her
have an
kids
account
play as
too.
well, right. So, yes. Did you know, by the way, that there is the number of people who become dentists, whose name is Dennis, right, has, and what was it, 850% more likely, right, than would have happened if it were just random. Okay, Meta and trading on Meta is a real thing. Okay, and this is not just dentists, it's just, this is the word and its reality. Yes, sir.
So I want to just comment on something that she mentioned about the headset ecosystem, both for VR and AR. I work for a very small tech company, makes software for augmented reality, do a lot of work with the military, for example. But there are these fundamental issues with battery life, comfort, dizziness, a host of issues. You mentioned that you're not comfortable donning
Yes.
That's right.
a VR headset.
That's
when
right.
you're enclosed, all these sort of motion sickness.
Right.
Where do you see the state of the market today? Where do you see it going? When will this be ubiquitous? When will we be comfortable? Because we're not right now. I mean, I've tested a number of them.
Right.
And they all have issues, and it's a great,
Remember Google Glass?
well, yeah.
It was too early,
Are we still
but it's
too early?
closer. It's much closer than it was. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean,
I think I think within the next 10 years, which is when you talk
We'll
about
figure it out,
startup
yeah.
and VC, early stage investing and traditional equity investing, if you enter at the pre-seed or the seed, you're looking at a 10 to 14 year lifespan for that to really occur. You have to hold it out. So in that time frame, yes, that's a long time to wait. Do I think it'll be sooner? I think it's definitely within the next 10 years. Who's to know if it's within the next 5 years? I think it matters that they are thinking about how other populations experience it, like the people who are neurodivergent, for example. Because if you develop towards them and build tools towards them, they will be more comfortable for broader populations as well.
Yeah.
So who gets the funding and who gets the use cases matters in the adoption is something that I would address, and how quickly that happens.
Okay, quick follow-up. When does a headset or a set of glasses replace this? Is that in that 10-year timeframe?
Probably not 10 years. I would give it a good 20 years and maybe even a little longer. But I do think that over time, it will largely change from something we must hold to something that's easier to wear. And it may be multiple devices that would go, in multiple ways. But yes, the technology, hardware must also follow that technology software, or it ain't gonna happen, right? We can't keep cranking the dial to get the car to go.
I think there's an interesting overlap between the two sides of this too, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on the access point to the metaverse through AR right now is that cell phone, right? Because those are ubiquitous even in places where the internet and access to computers and access to good schooling are not. And so I think there's a really interesting tie that I want to get this group's thoughts on it between the access of the early adopters shaping the experience. So what Mark Zuckerberg is doing is paving the way to solve those big problems that no one else has the money to do. He is the one figuring out how do you not get motion sickness, because nobody else is going to literally throw their money in a trash fire to do that, because there isn't money in solving that problem. The money comes in after it's solved. And so I think, as someone who works for a company that had a failed VR product, he burned all of the sort of light touch interests. But the real access is going to continue to be in gaming and education. And that is, I think, by investing in the people that are doing that in ways that protect the participants, I think that the early adopters will shape the rest of the experience.
Even in HR, in training, in human, it's in the human connection and training people to do things. It very much is going to be use case driven, and where that adoption has. Gaming is one place, but these people are looking at it from a hiring standpoint. They are looking at it from, she mentioned surgery, being able to do mining more safely was another that we heard. Everything up to space exploration. It's the use case that's driving it, and so I hear your point on the burning of money, especially for a hardware product. It's a very, very tough startup business for exactly why you've described, capital intensive and difficult to get right, and is only adopted when it's right. And the competition, it doesn't matter if they haven't taught the market yet. So you have that aspect of it, but then there are entry points into these other use cases where people want to adopt it because it will make jobs easier, but also safer.
Yeah.
and in our interaction with robots. So we may not be the ones wearing the devices, but the devices may be interacting with us, right? There's not just us in it, but also us in it, but also in our world and our element. And I think that's coming, and I think that's it before the next 10 years. That's easier to get accustomed to, easier to interact with, to get the feedback, to understand what the computer is telling you. There are things that a computer can deliver you that a human cannot. It's a very different tool. So the use case is likely to drive it. And then ultimately, if there are physical manifestations, which there will be, they will have to start to match those use cases and be able to assist in those use cases.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you all.